Order, order. I call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on women in the armed forces. It is a pleasure to have with us a very distinguished panel, and I would introduce each of them by turn. Firstly, once again, we have the Minister for Veterans and People, Alistair Carns. That's twice in 2 weeks, Minister. Thank you very much for taking the time. Also, we have with us the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Ben Key. We also have with us the Chief of General Staff, General Sir Ronald Walker. And we have with us the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, and also Sam DeForge, the Director of Conduct, Equity and Justice. Thank you very much for taking the time to appear before us for this hearing. And in fact, I understand that this is the first time that we have had all three chiefs for a Defence Committee evidence session since 2011. So that's 14 years in the making, and I'm very, very grateful to all of your good selves for accepting my request last year and appearing before the new committee. And today's evidence session, obviously on women in the armed forces, we will be discussing many aspects of horrendous and horrible behaviour, some harrowing accounts. So I just wanted to set at the outset that, look, most of our armed forces, we know they do an impeccable job, impeccable service, but it is our job as the Defence Committee to be asking those difficult questions to make sure that those behavioural changes are there based on the excellent work of our predecessor Defence Committee. And to any young women and young girls watching out there, I do want to encourage you to apply to join the armed forces. That is incredibly important, but I am hoping that the previous committee's work, as well as the work of this newly elected Defence Committee, will make sure that the work atmosphere, the environment for you will be a lot better, and that's our job to expose some of that wrongdoing. And also I would request, given that we've got quite a few members on the panel, that not every member of the panel needs to answer every single question, because there is a lot of ground to cover. And I would also urge members, sometimes they may wish to direct their questions to a particular member of the panel. So with that, let's just to get things started. I think, Minister, you'll be aware that it's been nearly 4 years since the work of the previous committee and the Atherton report was published. Have there been any meaningful, measurable improvements in women's experiences in the armed forces in that time? And if you can come with certain examples, and what is your measurement framework as well, please?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, any unacceptable behaviour is unwelcomed in defence, and we've got to make defence the most welcoming and positive place for anyone to come and work, whether that be women or otherwise. Since the Atherton report in 2021, we've accepted and addressed all the recommendations. The only two that we have left are the sexual harassment survey, which we're due to push out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're just working on some of the wording with that. We'd also like, actually, interestingly, to align that to the rest of government, so we could pull the whole of government statistics together and have some comparisons there. And the second one is the female veteran strategy, which we'll cover later on, but on the new veteran strategy, we'll have a female-specific section to it. And then we've 3 of those we haven't accepted, which is all sexual offending referred to the civilian police, which we can talk about again later on, and the recognition of military sexual trauma. So from the Atherton report, we've done quite a lot in the last 4 years. We've obviously only been in for 9 months, and that's progressing really, really well. The statistics that we have to measure the impact or the lived experience of women in the armed forces goes through a variety of different methodologies. One is obviously through what comes through the service justice system. The one is through complaints, and then we have the AFCAS system. Interestingly, and it's something, again, we can discuss later in more detail, we've had an increase in some of those complaints, because actually some of the procedures we put in place now make it far more acceptable for women to make those complaints. They feel that they will be dealt with in a more effective manner and indeed brought to resolution, which is creating an increase in people forthcoming with that information.
Good. General Sir Roly Walker, any initial comments on, do you think that the measures that you've taken, have they improved? How do you know that they've improved? And measurement framework, perhaps.
Thank you. It's my first appearance at any House of Commons committee, so thank you for the opportunity. And I'm very glad it's on this subject. It's a matter that is very important to me personally as well as professionally. A subject that I have been involved in at least the last 3 appointments that I've had, and has forced me to do some pretty deep thinking about why we're in this situation and what we can do about it. Specifically to the changes, there are a whole host of changes that that you'll be aware of in the written answer. What I would call out is the measurement framework, interestingly, which I think is a new initiative in the last year within the Army, trying to baseline against industry standards of how you measure culture, behaviour, attitudes, and perceptions, and how you can ingest as much of the data that we have through surveys, through reports, through statistics, and how you can then do the analysis of that to draw deductions. The point of it really is getting to the point where we are looking at very specific interventions where the data takes us to where we still need to do more work. So I think that's an area for further development. It's beyond the proof of concept for us as a service, but I think it's one of these things that we would look to scale.
Okay. First Sea Lord, any initial comments on what's been happening?
Thank you very much, Chairman. And firstly, I'd just like to echo and support the Minister's views that we are determined absolutely to create a Royal Navy in which people are judged for their professional conduct, welcome for the contribution they make and accepted for who they are, and that behaviours that run counter to that will not be accepted, and particularly those around unwelcome sexual behaviours. We've made a number of changes in the last 2.5 years, particularly since the former female submariner, Miss Sophie Brooke, came forward with her allegations in the Daily Mail, and which were then reported by me last October, as well as issuing a public apology for the treatment that she had clearly experienced. But alongside that, we didn't wait for those investigations to conclude. So we've established a culture and leadership cell headed up by a 1-star. We have engaged broadly with our sister services and actually externally to put ourselves to find best practice and to work out what are the most sort of cutting edge academic thinking that we can embrace and not hide behind, well, we're a seafaring service and so therefore we're special and unique. We're not. We're different, but we have to work out how we embrace those. We've opened up other ways for women to raise concerns about inappropriate behaviour, and the introduction of a centralised email box, the introduction of accessibility through an app for raising service complaints, have all seen an increase in the number of service complaints, which the Service Complaints Ombudsman, Marriott Hughes, I know has reported to you, has seen rising confidence in a system where people's voices will be heard. And I know from my own informal conversations around the units I visit, that the fact that we've moved the admissibility away from the chain of command into a central admissibility system, the fact that we have done much more to train the people who do the investigations, and for all of the cases now around unwanted sexual behaviour, a single 2-star Director Personnel and Training, Rear Admiral Jude Terry, is the deciding body, which has brought much greater consistency into the way we look at it. So our record is now we have removed people from the service, including those who have commanded, and where we have discovered or where their behaviours were not appropriate, or we have removed people from positions of responsibility before situations have got out of hand. So we think that we're seeing a change, but we're also seeing a positive change. So we're seeing a slow But positive increase in the number of women expressing an interest in joining. Okay. We're seeing positive career progression, and we have an increase in the number of female role models at senior rank across the service, including Lee, the first woman to command an aircraft carrier, recognising now...
We will come on to those aspects later.
But it's
on
just
as well.
to sort of put the context that there is a how are we getting after, and also what are we doing to improve.
Agree. And that's why I wanted to make sure that each of your good selves has the chance to set the context, just as I set the context for the meeting, so that you can lay on the record some of the work that's been happening. Air Chief Marshal, in your opinion, have you taken enough steps? What has happened, especially since, for example, the red arrows, harrowing accounts and so on? What measures have you taken?
Build on what my colleagues have said, our fundamental job as the armed forces is to defend the country and for an air force to be ready to fly and fight, and that demands that we have the best team we can to do that, and that demands us creating an atmosphere where that team, everybody of that team feels that they can give their very best. That's how we will be operationally successful and deliver what it is that our citizens and government expect of us. But sadly, we do get cases of unacceptable behaviours, and you've identified some already. And the damage, and I've seen this personally, the damage that this can do to those victims and survivors can be enormous. And so our job as leaders is to reduce the likelihood of that happening. And that's about changing culture, which takes time, and building trust for women in the system about how that system operates. We know we haven't always got that rate right, but we are making improvements. So from an Air Force perspective, we created a dedicated team to conduct investigations on complex, unacceptable behaviour cases. And that's kind of the model that you heard announced this morning is going to be rolled out more broadly to defence.
Yeah.
We have an
We'll come on to that one later as well.
We have an RAF climate assessment team. We publish the case outcomes on a quarterly basis, so our leadership, so we're very transparent about that, and we can build trust in the system. And we've reconfigured our service complaint system so it delivers speed and fairness and independence from the chain of command. And similarly with our disciplinary system. But if you look at you were asking about evidence and data. If you look at representation rates, the Air Force has grown to over 16% of it of our service people are women. Our retention rates are up, so a smaller proportion of women than men leave, and our recruitment rates for women are also up, and a number of applications
we will come on to recruitment and retention later on, so you'll have the chance to, when members question on that particular issue. I just wanted to bring in briefly also Ms. DeFors, in terms of your experience as the Director of Conduct, Equity and Justice, if you'd just like to lay very briefly your introductory remarks.
So I think when we look at this sort of organisational change, any organisation of this size and complexity has got to go on a bit of a cultural maturity journey insofar as you need to have certain interventions at the early stages. You then need to tweak and adjust those interventions as you move along, as the culture of the organisation starts to change. So I think we are seeing, and colleagues have touched on them, a lot of green shoots. I mean, I think the expressions of interests from women is really positive. The pretty much doubling of service complaints coming through over the last 3 years. I think actually you will have seen, because stats are really valuable, but also the anecdotal evidence that we've been able to confidentially share with you from folk who have used the Victim and Witness Care Unit. I think we're seeing increasing confidence in order to take things forward and to raise them, and in the support we're seeing far more women moving up through the chain of command as well. So I think there's a lot of green shoots of data. I think none of us are under any illusion that this is solved. This is ongoing work, but we're starting to see that come through in the data.
Good. Well, it's good that you've set the context. But Minister, the correspondence that I and the committee have received, for example, from the MOD trade unions, is quite counter to the narrative that has just been set out in terms of sexual harassment and assault in the defence sector. And I quote, "We've been perpetually disappointed by the response to this by MOD. The severity of the complaints is only matched by the poor response." So, according to them, this has to stop. That the MOD must be made to tackle the issue and not be given a choice to simply hold perpetual meetings to discuss it. So are there too many meetings being held? Are there too many discussions and not enough tangible action?
I actually think there's been a lot of action. If I was to lay out since 2022 what we've delivered to the armed forces, we've taken the Defence Serious Crime Unit out of the single services and created an entity that's separate to the single services. That's now held in very high regard. On top of that, we've got the victim and witness care unit. We've created zero tolerance, which has reduced anybody's ability to get out from being held to account. We've created the My Complaint app so people can separately come in and make complaints. We've got mandatory training now, of which I went through when I was serving, across everybody within the armed forces. We've got service complaint reform in all three of the single services, and we can talk to about what we're doing. This is what's been done already. We've got made sure women are on every court-martial board, and ensuring that the complaint system is already separate to the chain of command, i.e. your lieutenant colonel or your wing commander in charge will not be the individual dealing with your complaint. It will go side and up. In specific, when we're talking about civil service, which I think is the issue, I've sat down and spoken to trade unions twice on this, and this is about ensuring that when defence works together with the civil service, in particular within main buildings, so the department, that we have the right culture. And whilst this cultural change has been going on within the defence sector, it hasn't necessarily been going on within the civil service, and we've got more work to do there.
I know you've taken on board your brief very recently, and you're having those engagements with the unions. But the evidence that we've received thus far seems to run counter. So obviously there's a lot of work to do there. General, I want to come on to your good self. There have been very horrendous examples of behaviour uncovered by some excellent investigative reporting, including from Sky News and with Becky Johnson and Rebecca Spencer, and that a lot of that. It just seems that the measures that you've talked about, that they don't seem to have had the effect that's required, and it hasn't increased the confidence of service women. How would you respond to that?
With a great deal of sympathy and acceptance of that. I think to one of your points at the start, when we look at the raw numbers, which is to perhaps over-rationalise the fact that there are real victims who fear perpetrators and predatory behaviour. Most people in the army are able to come to work every day and go about their business without being bullied, harassed or discriminated against. So from our records, 4% of all of the cases of misconduct or offences, all of the offences and the misconduct are only carried out by 4% of our personnel. So by definition, 96% of our staff are able to come to work and do their job without fear or favour. Now, 4% is still a large number of people when you consider the size of the British Army. So I absolutely recognise that we still have work to do. There are some recurring themes which we are addressing. Self-evidently, there continues to be a prevalence of bullying, harassment and discrimination within our ranks. Any number of reviews and from the complaints and from the testimonials tell us that that is true. So that is absolutely accepted. The other angle to this I think we need to confront head on, as you touch on, is a lack of confidence in the complaints process. Firstly, whether there will be adverse repercussions of people complaining on their careers, or whether they feel that they don't have confidence that those complaints will be taken seriously. I recognise that, we recognise that. We are doing what we can to understand the data, understand where those hotspots are, and work out what are those interventions that, as I said before, being led by the data. Inevitably, we have to recognise that there are some cultural and structural barriers still. There is an association of masculinity with soldiering. That's been identified in the Wigston report. We have to recognise that is a barrier to integration. We have to find a way, I think, to begin the decoding of that association and a recoding around professional behaviours and operational impact, much like my other service chiefs have all said.
And so you ensure that those people will get justice, so those women, and that those changes are being made. I want to just go on to Admiral, if I may, with your good self, around WhatsApp groups. Now, is there a policy around WhatsApp groups? Especially, I was reading through some of the evidence that we'd received in 2023, for example, and according to one individual young woman, horrific commentary on military WhatsApp groups, and inappropriate images sent via work messaging groups, racist and sexist discriminatory language and bullying and harassment, and a lot worse thereafter as well. So I think this could perhaps be the next big scandal to hit the MOD if we're not careful. That it only takes somebody to either leak what's some of the commentary in those WhatsApp groups, or for journalists to get to the bottom, or for those to be hacked. So what has been set in place to deal with WhatsApp groups?
We're entirely clear that if information like this is brought to our attention, that people are exhibiting unwelcome behaviours or thoughts or language, then we will deal with it. Now, we can only deal with the evidence that's brought to us. So I recognise that you've had evidence given to you that exists, and I don't deny for one moment that there will be people out there who are putting on WhatsApp groups messages that we would all feel extremely uncomfortable with. And we're completely clear that when that has an impact upon others, we will take action if it's brought to our attention. So this is not in any sense, a tolerance of these sorts of behaviours. There's a huge amount of education that goes on through the culture work, through the visits to units, through the education now. Every training course includes activity to specifically show not just what we expect, but also how people's behaviours can have an unintended impact upon others, where we need to sort of hold up that mirror and help them understand that what may have been acceptable before they joined the service is no longer acceptable now. And we also give and expect the chain of command, people around them in that community, to call it out whenever they come across it. Because it can have that injurious impact, even if for everybody else on that WhatsApp group it would be considered acceptable. Otherwise they would have said something about it themselves. So we do not, but I think at the heart, you started your question, what is the policy? I don't think we can set a policy that says you cannot have WhatsApp groups. All we can do is say that we've got to...
I think it's about having proactive policies to make sure that people engaging in banter, and especially if they are somewhat testosterone filled, as has been conveyed to me on occasions, that there is something that's going to be done proactively to ensure that that is not happening.
As soon as anything like that is brought to our attention, as we now have evidence to demonstrate, whether that's through the email box, whether that's through talking to the chain of command, whether that's using the My Navy app, any of that, there is a centralised system for triaging it and seeing what is the most appropriate route for investigating and dealing with it.
There's an education and communication programme that goes on now across all of defence. Every individual has to go through that mandatory training, which sets the standards.
So let's hope that we don't uncover anything very, very...
Well, we need to also be honest that we cannot eradicate it whatsoever. Yeah. We've got to accept that this behaviour, we're trying to reduce it as best as possible, but we can't rule it out completely. There is every chance that stuff will come up, but when it does, what I would say is Defence will treat it with the absolute severity that it requires.
Good. Chief Marshal, just finally with yourself, before I bring in my colleague Mike Martin as well. Obviously, we've seen the announcement this morning from the MOD, which, by the way, I had no prior knowledge of, and neither did committee members. So some of us were remarking earlier as to it's very interesting timing that should be announced this morning before our evidence session. But I wanted to come in on concurrent jurisdiction. Now, it's said that army complaints are going to be taken out of officers' hands, but not all aspects of the process will be completely independent. So there's that particular thing. And also, it is also a matter of record that the jurisdiction within civilian courts, that actually has led to better outcomes for service women than simply when they're going through the military courts and the court martial. So how are you going to ensure that women do get justice, the service women?
Which elements, Chair, won't be independent? What are you talking about specifically? Because there is centralised admissibility for service complaints, and then if it meets a criminal threshold, then it's investigated by the Defence Service Complaints Unit. So that is completely independent. So I'm not quite sure what you're asking about.
My question is around, for example, the mother of Gunner Jaisley Beck, that the demands that they had made, that those were not fully met, that the announcement is only partial, so it's not a case of a complete independent process. It is rather a bit of this and a bit that. It's a mix rather than having that justice that somebody in a civilian court will be able to have, but somebody who is serving a brave servicewoman will not have access to that same justice.
I think your question is, we have a service justice system and there is a civilian criminal justice system, and so there are two routes by which people may be investigated and prosecuted. Sam is the best person to talk about it from a defence perspective, but victims have options about which justice system they wish to see their complaint investigated under. But Sam's probably best.
42% of all of those cases go through the civilian court anyway. So you have a choice. If you're an individual and you're going through your witness protection program, you have a choice to go through the service justice system or indeed through the criminal justice system. And I think we don't want to close either one of those off. So I think it's very much down to the victim to choose which avenue they'd like to take.
You wanted to comment?
Can I help? So I think your question was talking about two slightly different things. So if we talk about service complaints, and if we think about that in a civilian context, you might call them grievances, for example, workplace grievances. So the changes made in 22 were that those complaints, instead of being dealt with by your local chain of command, they were taken away so that they were dealt with by central admissibility teams within each service. The announcement that the Minister's made today is to say for those most serious complaints, so workplace grievances if you like, those are being taken out of the single services and moved into a separate team to deal with them, so they are not in the single service chain of command. Concurrent jurisdiction is around justice. So if we think about the civilian justice system and the service justice system, which is a different element, which is crime. So service complaints are not about crimes, although someone might raise a complaint that's actually a crime and then should be referred across.
Agreed. I'm aware of the distinction. Obviously, it's just the conviction rate. But I think my colleague Mike Martin wanted to come in on this particular point.
Thanks, Chair. It's a question for General Walker, actually. I know, General, that you're aware of the more than 1,000 women who shed stories on Fill Your Boots, which is a social media account about being raped and abused and harassed. And I'm just going to read some of them out here, just to put them on the record. I used to hold my breath in my room at night when they were trying the door to make them think I was out. Another one. I was being bullied and harassed by a senior commissioned officer. I raised it, but it was ignored. Another one. A sergeant kicked me to the floor, pinned me down, acted out a sex act on me in front of a warrant officer. Nothing was ever done. There's another one. I was coming back from the toilet one day when a bloke came out of the showers, pinned me against the wall, dropped his towel and told me that he knew exactly what I needed. It goes on. You know, one time I hadn't locked my door. The man walked in, looked me dead in the eyes and smiled at me. When I didn't smile back, he moved towards me until I yelled at him to get out. Thankfully, he did leave, but then nothing was ever done. So much of what we've heard this morning from you and your colleagues, General, those complaints relate to the army, which is why I'm asking you the question, are around process and around structure. And process and structure are important, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. These allegations, if proven true, are really, to get to the heart of the matter, are about command and about leadership. They're a command and a leadership responsibility. And I think you, in your responses to these, you said that that senior ranks might have even been actively complicit in those cases. So in cases like this, what does command and leadership mean to you? What actions should the chain of command be taking to make sure that this doesn't happen? And should that involve, frankly, removing people, sacking people from service for acts like this? Is this not the only way to deal with this kind of behaviour?
Thank you. Like you, I can tell by the way you're reading those stories how upset they make you feel, how angry they make me feel, how ashamed I am as the head of the army that those are what our soldiers are reporting. I mean, I share probably, we've soldiered together, we know what this feels like. So I come at this from a position of anger, of emotion, and of a desire like you to see some form of justice or reconciliation. It hurts me that young people volunteer to join our army, citizens volunteer to fight for this country. Combat is hard enough as it is when everything's on the line and the only thing you've got is your teamwork around you to keep you safe. It angers me that those people are having to fight their own people before they get in front of the enemy. So I'm with you. This is a chain of command responsibility. That chain of command has got to be robust, resilient, disciplined, and effective under the most tremendous loads of combat. So we've got to enforce and ensure that our chain of command does its job. That's why I wrote to my chain of command. It was a very, very specific letter to my chain of command. This is on us. In the army, you know that the greatest risks are carried by our most junior soldiers, probably with the least amount of experience. Our motto as an officer corps is we serve to lead. We serve those that we lead. It is our job to make sure that the difficult and dangerous tasks they've got to deal with, we make it as easy as possible for them to do it, but it is never an easy job. So I'm absolutely committed to putting my chain of command from the most newly promoted Lance Corporal to me as a 4-star General. We are collectively responsible for making sure our soldiers can come to work without fearing their own people. So there are a whole raft of measures that were already underway through the service inquiry into Jaisley Beck's tragic death, as well as reflections of the testimonials we heard, which aren't just from the Army, they're from across all the services, both veteran and current. And we've got to onboard that. But that's why I said it's my chain of command.
How many, sorry to cut you off, but how many people have been sacked in the Army in the last 4 years, say, because of allegations like this?
In terms of the...
So I can give you overall, so there's over 100 people that have been kicked out of the armed forces for either sexual offending, unacceptable sexual behaviours or sexual relationships between trainees and...
I want to bring in my colleague Calvin Bailey here as well, please.
Okay, and yet there has been no change in the AFCAS reporting of bullying, harassment or discrimination 3.5 years since our report. A policy of zero tolerance is clearly meaningless because the culture is a manifestation of leadership, accepted standards and values. Sir Mark Roly, Metropolitan Police Commissioner, faces similar organisational challenges, and in doing so we have a list of evidential actions including removal of leaders, as was just discussed, and his testing to the limits of our law in trying to address the culture that he sees within his organisation. And yet we have seen nothing similar from you. You asked leaders like me to be accountable, to be active bystanders. You told us to challenge the group captain that in a room of 100 people denigrated female colleagues by saying she's a good girl, she does sport and the weather. You asked us to challenge that the same individual, when they denounced the need for International Women's Day and in the room publicly questioning the service's values that you asked us to uphold. And for the victims, you asked them to speak up, and you asked them to trust the system when she was sexually assaulted. You perpetuated the system that meant that informal resolution would time her out, meaning that the problem about which she would think very carefully about raising would result in her exiting the service, so that, like all the other victims, they sit out on the outside watching those that have failed them promote. Progress has been, or these people, has been baked into the culture of your services like volcanic ash in tree rings. We know who these people are. You know of whom I speak. You choose not to act, but we remain active bystanders. So like Sir Mark, I don't see any leadership, unlike Sir Mark. So evidence, I would like to see evidence of a desire to change. And I ask, to change the culture, do we need to change the leadership?
I'd like to just on statistics there,
I think the Admiral wanted to come in on
if
this.
I may. I absolutely get where you're coming from, and we take these issues absolutely to the exceptionally seriously. Just on AFCAS reporting, though, marginal though it may be, we've seen an increase in percentage of the decrease in personnel experienced bullying across the armed forces. And what's really important, and this is where we talk to Mike's point about structures, we see an increase in confidence to make a formal written complaint increasing by 3% as well. That's resulted in a spike of complaints, and I would like to say, and as you have seen recently, we have taken advice that has gone on probably for now 4 or 5 years to take the service complaint system and put it into a tri-service pot. Now, it's addressing some of the leadership as raising our standards programme, which we can talk about in a minute. But the structural space, we're taking the tri-service complaint system out of the single services for the first time in history, which is fantastic. And then the second piece, and I always say this when a young Marine joining up, if you ever wanted to make a complaint, your corporal was the individual you went to. He went to the sergeant, he went to the troop commander. There was no place ever to go left or right to make a complaint if you indeed were being harassed in any way, shape or form, especially if you're a female or a minority. And that's why we're also putting in place a violence against women and girls task force held by me, working towards me, so we can implement best practice in all the single services. And that has been supported by the single service chiefs and will be an egress point outside of the chain of command. So any woman or girl has an issue can go left or right, highlight the concern and go straight to the top to me and then back down. Good. Because without that, it's very difficult to do.
Admiral, you wanted to respond to Captain Bailey's?
Yes, I would, because there is one point where I do slightly take a different line. Miss Brooke had left the service when she went to the Daily Mail and raised her concerns, and we treated her as if she was still serving. We set up an entire investigation team to meet with her, to hear her allegations, which she was kind enough to put forward, brave enough to put forward. We investigated every single one of them as if she was still serving. We recognised that others would want to come forward, and we established a confidential mailbox that would happen. And as a result of the number of recommendations that extensive investigation revealed, we discharged directly 3 people from the service based upon the poor leadership and behaviours that they had exhibited. And during the same period, discharged another 18 because of the wider evidence that came forward. So I recognise that there is a huge amount to do. We have still got some distance to go in bringing confidence to all of the women in the service that they will be heard. But to say that we are not taking action and that we are timing people out while I've been First Sea Lord is not true. We have acted wherever we have found and people have been willing to come forward. And to give us the evidence, we have then pursued that through and dealt with those who have transgressed. I would also observe that the bit that we're now really getting after, because of course doing things after the fact and later doesn't help those who are experiencing it at the time. So one of the things we now do is that culture visits, climate assessments are regularly taken of all units, particularly those coming back from long deployments, to find out whether or not the leadership on board was appropriate. They are trusted mechanisms. We've had to double the number of teams we have doing it. And that gives us a far quicker feedback loop then on those who have met our standards and those who have not. And we then make a judgment about how we help and mentor to improve where it is a question of rehabilitation, or we act when people have found to have deliberately transgressed.
Admiral, that's all very positive. However, that is all in response to things which have happened. We need to see evidence of proactive picking people off in the way that the Met, the Commissioner and the Met has observed that there are problems with culture, and that he's picked those people out to make the organisation acceptable to those people coming up.
But as a result of one of those culture visits, we removed a commanding officer, not because of a direct complaint made by an individual, but because the culture visit identified that things were not right, and therefore that commanding officer was removed.
Thank you. General, similar?
So, in part to the questions before, in terms of discharge, with regards to zero tolerance sexual offences, 31 have convicted, of which 28 are discharged. 3 were not discharged, but subject to Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So that, I think, is pretty definitive. In terms of the new policy around instructor-trainee relationships, where there's a zero tolerance for that, all of the cases, all of those that have been investigated have been discharged. And in terms of unacceptable sexual behaviours, 188 cases have been investigated under the zero tolerance policy, of which 23 were discharged, 37 have been awarded a sanction of lesser than termination of service, and importantly, 128 have been dealt with at informal resolution at the request of the complainants, which we understand from the SCOAP is an example of best practice. So, to the challenge, we don't deal with this, and people aren't discharged. They are. And in terms of, I think your generic point of removal from positions of command, we do that irrespective of rank. And we have discharged generals, and we've discharged colonels, and we've discharged majors.
Michelle Scroggin wants to come in on this particular point.
Yeah, could I just clarify, Admiral? When you say that the commanding officer was removed, do you mean moved elsewhere or sacked?
In this particular instance, removed elsewhere, because it was clear that although there's a difference between responding to unwelcome sexual behaviour that has happened, in which we discharge, or the presumption is of discharge, unless there are significant extenuating circumstances. For a commanding officer, I can't think of what that could remotely be. Or the proactive work, which is to identify that command culture doesn't feel quite right. That doesn't mean that deliberate acts have gone awry, but it still feels like that individual is struggling to create on board the sort of climate where people feel acknowledged for what they contribute, recognised for who they are, and can feel perfectly safe about coming to work and giving of their best. If actually what's been set on board is something that is counter to that, which can often then lead to people being fearful to raise their hands if they encounter inappropriate behaviour, which then leads to the sort of horrific examples that have been read out by 2 of the members of the committee, then we need to proactively change the leadership on board in order to create the right climate so that there is that safety net. Because to pretend that all of this behaviour has been eradicated, as the Minister has said, is naivety of the first order. So we have to be really clear and act swiftly when it is encountered. But most importantly, we have to create a climate and a culture where we reduce the chances, as the Chief of the Air Staff said, of it ever happening, because either it's going to be dealt with informally and called out at a local level, and therefore you get that informal resolution that most people would want, or there's an absolute acceptance of those who attempted to behave poorly, that if they're found out, they will be dealt with. And so there's very much an affirmation of what is right and a sanction for what is wrong.
Right, sorry, just on that, my concern is, are we just moving the problem elsewhere? Because if there's an issue with that commanding officer and the way they deal with something in one position, is that not just moving it somewhere else? What checks and balances are going in place?
I draw a distinction between a commanding officer who has not handled something correctly, which arguably is a tolerance, therefore, of wrong. That then will inevitably lead down administrative sanction of some form or another. and the commanding officer who's just falling short of creating the right culture. In other words, they just don't have the wherewithal. We may have not selected them correctly. All the evidence would indicate someone with the right potential, but actually they've just fallen short. You either then provide mentoring to help them recover that position, or if you feel that they're not going to make it, we remove them. But that can't be a career jeopardy because they've not done anything wrong. It's just that their opportunity, and I see where you're coming from, it's just that we've decided that they're just not up for command. They can't lead broader groups of people. They haven't done anything wrong. To then career check them so completely would feel to be inappropriate and potentially open for complaint back the other way. And we're trying to balance both of those.
I believe Mike Martin wanted to come in from here as well.
Thanks. Minister, as a priority, where does the treatment of women sit within wider defence priorities?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's on my top 6. It's in there, and it's all about cultural change, of which this is a key strand to it. We've been working really hard over the last 6-7 months to sort of push forward some change, and it takes quite a long time to change some of the structures in defence. You talked about leadership and behaviour. Within the first couple of weeks of coming in, myself and Sam and a key group of women leaders in defence sat down. We've launched our Raising Our Standards platform, which isn't maintaining the standards, it's about raising it up. There are principles that sit below it. And then under that, we put in place two key real themes. The first one is a tri-service complaints programme to take that complaint system away from single services. We mentioned that before. That will go some way to giving people confidence that the Army, the Navy and Air Force aren't marking their own homework, which is really important. And the second one is the Violence Against Women and Girls task force that we're pulling together. And that's where we've worked with Jess Phillips on that. I sit in the Violence Against Women and Girls task force that sits cross-government. We've pulled some of those lessons into defence. That's going to be a body that's going to work to me, and then it will have its tentacles down into the single services. So if anyone has any issues, they can go to those individuals and propel it right to the top really, really quickly. So it's really, really important to us.
Thanks. And then if I could just ask the other members of the panel, perhaps starting with Sam, you, what does good look like? You know, we're doing all of this, and we're not going to get rid of it entirely. I accept that. Any organisation is always going to have, you know, problems. But what does good look like?
So this is something we talk quite often with our international colleagues as well, because this is a challenge that is faced by armed forces across NATO, Five Eyes, etc. I think there is a mix of the data. So we've talked about sort of a 100% increase in service complaints over the last year. We would expect to see those complaints going up. We'd expect to see them then plateau and drop. So there are data points that will show us that. AFCAS, etc., seeing that. We ultimately really want folk to... We don't want things to happen in the first place, so we want to have really strong education about that. And I know service colleagues can talk in particular to some of the changes they've made over the last couple of years in that space. But when they do happen, we want folk to be confident in reporting and confident that something will happen in response to that report. So talking very much about 100% action. I think also one of the other lessons that we've been taken from a number of our other international colleagues, and again it goes back to this sort of an intervention at this point in the journey versus an intervention at this point in the journey, we have to change them. So there's something very much about the assurance. So how are we really confident that as the whole of defence that we are following these approaches, that we are delivering what we think we are delivering? And actually one of the other things the Minister has asked for is an independent KC review of the zero tolerance cases where we have retained folk, because actually so there can be some really correct and fair reasons for doing that, but let's get some independent assurance about how we are doing that. The other thing, and again working with Jess Phillips and colleagues across government, is what is the opportunity for, if you like, rehabilitation as well. So how can we create an opportunity whereby perhaps folk haven't stepped over the line, but they've stepped a little bit close to it. And when we look at some of the stats coming out of the world of education, where actually, some of the highest levels of allegations of rape are amongst 14-year-olds, recognising some of those challenges, some of those almost gateway behaviours that can lead to some of the worst behaviours. How can we really make sure that we are recognising and understanding that? And in our phase 1 and our phase training, right the way phase 2 training, right the way through, we're putting interventions in place. So I think we have a long way to go, and we can't be naive about that. But actually, one of the things all of us actually regularly do is engage with our service women's networks, a number of whom are here today, who provide some of that challenge. And actually, I'm looking forward to the day where they say, do you know what, it's great.
Mike, what looks really good is when women turn up to work and they can enjoy work and have a great time and go home without any concerns about any predatory or unwanted sexual behaviour. That's what good looks like. How do we measure that?
Exactly.
That's through AFCAS, it's through complaints, it's through the offences system, and to ensure that that hockey stick that's gone up just now, which we think has gone up because of the confidence in the system to report, comes down. And that's one of the... So all of the facts and none of the understanding is really dangerous. It's a balance of the facts.
Like, what's the metric?
So it's the metrics, I think.
Give me a number.
So, for example,
what date, what level?
There were 3,000 offences in the service justice system last year. 33% of those were disciplinary, 24% were fraud, 19% theft, 12% violent offences, 8% sexual offences. We'd like to bring that down over time. We'd like to bring it down straight away.
What?
Well, to as minimal as possible. But I'm going to be really honest, as I said early on. The ability to bring that to zero in a population that we have within defence is going to be exceptionally
Could we bring it to a commensurate level that the civilian population has, for instance? Could we balance out sexual offences to the same level that they occur in the civilian
interesting,
population?
there's 2 points on that. So on offences, absolutely we'd like to do. On complaints is slightly different, for the simple reason that in the complaint system, certain organisations usually work on an AIM principle. That AIM principle puts unwanted sexual behaviour in 3 brackets: inappropriate, problematic and abusive and violent. With our zero tolerance policy, everything goes into the right bucket, which in some cases skews the statistics when in comparison to civilian organisations. Because we deal with it, we have zero tolerance of it, so it pushes it to the right of arc. Whereas those in the problematic or inappropriate may not even be mentioned in other organisations. So we've got to be careful of statistics and how we compare them. That's why when we take our sexual harassment study that we want to push out, we don't just want to do it in defence. We want to make sure that every other government is doing it in the same process, so we can balance it all and provide the data.
Thank you. General Roly, you were going to say something.
It's to your question of what does good look like. I mean, I'm completely with you. You know, the kit fitting, people not being discriminated at work. That's not good. That's the minimum that we should be expecting, right? So good, I think, to quote the lead of our or the team from our Army Service Women's Network, is really simple. They just want to come to work and feel safe, physically and in terms of their healthcare.
That's hard to measure. So should we put a number on it? Would you commit to putting a number on it in the Army?
Their perception. The second thing is they just want to be valued for the equitable contribution they make. So I think there is a high degree of subjectivity to this, but it's around, and therefore to me the litmus test is that network and the feedback that I'm getting. Are we making the right interventions? Are they seeing the changes that they need? And recognizing that there is some things that are the minimum standards, and not to settle for the minimum being considered good. That's just the entry level that they should expect.
It does feel
really
hard to
good.
measure, though, right?
I believe Fred Thomas wanted to come in on this particular point as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Question for the Minister. Sexual misconduct against women, as we've heard this morning, is a problem across our military. Which of the 3 services is it worst in?
Well, you can say which is it worst in. We've got different sizes of different services with different female populations. So saying it's statistically worse in one over the other, I think, is the wrong way to look at it. For example, 1,300 complaints by women, 81 of those in particular around sexual harassment and bullying. Those 81 complaints are the ones that I think the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force need to get involved in the earliest stage to ensure they're dealt with in the most appropriate manner. We've seen harrowing cases in all 3 services. We're trying to reduce that as best as we can. And I go back to the facts and the understanding. We've got to use the facts to hold us to account. But there's also the understanding. You know, I've met at the moment, just recently with the Women's Network. I've met with Jess Phillips and the Violence Against Women and Girls. I've met with Forward Assist, the charities. When they turn around and we get a positive feel from that, that's some of the understanding. Combine that with the facts. That's when I think we can say we're improving. The risk is if you take either one of those, based on some of those comparable points you just made, out of in isolation to the understanding, you skew the system, and I don't think it's the right way of looking at it.
Thank you, Minister, and I'm glad to hear that it's in your top 6 priorities, but unfortunately some of the numbers don't quite match with your aspirations. While you've been having various meetings with ministers and others, I think if we look at, what was it, the RAF executive leadership team, they only discussed this once because, and the reason why I'm rattling off these stats are because our committee asked the Tri-Services at the end of last year to provide us with stats as to how often they had discussed issues pertaining to women and about organisational culture. I can rattle off in terms of some of the others where they've only met twice, and also the sexual harassment survey, which you alluded to earlier. Now that was supposed to be launched last year. Unfortunately, that's been delayed, and now it's apparently we've been told it's late summer of this year. And also at this point, I'd like to point out that the Centre for Military Women's Research, they pointed out that, forget now, the outcomes of the 2023 sexual harassment survey, they had not seen any reporting of the outcomes of that. So there are so many holes and so much work that needs to be done in order for your aspiration to be met. But I'm sure that you'll no doubt cogitate on the lackluster stats that the Defence Committee has received. But I wanted to bring in Michelle Scroggum here as well.
Thank you, Chair. I'll point out to all of you on the committee, how confident are you that women in the armed forces are as safe from sexual violence and harassment as they would be in civilian life?
Could I just quickly, just on meetings, so we have a meeting in excess probably of once, if not twice a month on this subject in my office. That cascades down into multiple different meetings at different levels. The reason I have delayed the survey is because I want the survey to be rationalised with cross-government. There's no point us looking internally into defence and not having the ability to cross-reference that with all the other government departments, particularly police, etc. So we'd like to see one standardised sexual harassment survey go out cross-government so we can pull the statistics and the data together to get a proper analysis, which goes back to answering a point about Fred and Mike's comments about how do we measure our effectiveness. It must be comparable. We can't do it comparable if the survey is different. So we're getting on that. Sam, do you want to?
So one of our real challenges is comparisons, if we look at this through a justice lens, is comparisons between the civilian justice system and the service justice system. And these are recorded in very different ways, so there is a risk that it's quite misleading in terms of comparisons. I think if sort of going through that justice lens...
I think it's more about your own personal confidence. How confident are you that women in the armed forces are as safe from sexual violence and harassment as they would be in civilian life?
So having worked in private sector, public sector and in defence, I think that defence has some challenges which are very different. I think I have, and I'm conscious that I am in a senior role, which means that I have to really reach and talk to folk who are in more junior roles to understand their experiences. And I think I'm not naive that there are some people who are not having good experiences. I think that what we are seeing is that there is far better support for those folk now, certainly far better support than in the civilian justice system. I think that we are seeing increased confidence. I think interestingly, and Mariette Hughes mentioned this when she spoke to you recently, there is something about critical mass. So where we have particular teams or formations where there is a critical mass of women within them, actually they often report a really positive culture. I think where perhaps some of our concerns are more is in the sort of the ones and twos, the loneliness element, where folk might feel more isolated in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be in public sector and private sector. And I think those are the areas we're really interested in. And I think one of the bits of work that the Army have been doing at Sandhurst around critical mass, because if we can get after that critical mass, then that can be a real differentiator for enabling that
Are you confident that they are as safe in those services as they would be in civilian life?
So I think in the vast majority of cases, I still continue to worry about some of those isolated folk.
So I think in comparisons of civilian life, in some sections of defence, where there isn't that critical mass, I would say no. I would say when the critical mass is there, absolutely. And there are lots of women who have a fantastic career, some of which are sat in the audience here, and get to very high ranks within the military, no problem whatsoever. Where we've really got to focus is to ensure that people have an offset where individuals, if they have an issue, they can make a complaint outside of the chain of command and it can escalate rapidly, especially those areas where there's small numbers of women and they don't have enough people to provide
It is that the difference between, are you confident that they are as safe in those services as they would be in civilian life? It's black or white.
I don't really have the knowledge or the understanding, either the police, the fire service, or comparable organisations that are similar in structure, shape and work profile to the military, which there are very few to that within the armed forces. What I can say, absolute confidence, is that we're working exceptionally hard to make sure that women or any other minority in the armed forces get everything they need to be able to deliver what they need for them.
I believe the Air Chief Marshal wanted to come in there as well.
So you're asking a question about how we feel, but if I could just take us to the hard data, because I asked myself this question in preparation. So I got the crime survey for England and Wales. And what that crime survey shows that 3.3% of women, according to that crime survey, aged 16 years and over, were victims of sexual assault in the year to March 2022, which is the data. That is a higher rate than we see in the armed services, so that there is objective evidence around that. In terms of are we confident, the very fact that we've described a system that still needs to be evolved and developed tells us that there is more for us to do and that we cannot be complacent. But the hard numbers show that women in the services do not suffer a higher rate of sexual offences.
With respect, I would say the 1,000 that came forward after last month's figures came out, they're coming out after something has happened. If they don't have confidence to report that, I'm not confident to say that those figures are accurate. So if people can't come forward, you're not going to get the same numbers that you would in civilian life. So that's why I'm asking, how do you personally feel? Not what the numbers are telling you on the surface. Are you confident that women in the armed forces are as safe as they would be in civilian life? That's why it's not based on your numbers.
Michelle, I think those comments that came
feelings
in on the internet, on particular some websites that we saw, there was a cascade of stuff came in after Gunnerbeck, and we've taken that really seriously. We built a small task force inside the Serious Crime Unit to deal with those and look at them. I would encourage anyone
this is why I would rather have somebody give me their opinion, not what your numbers are telling you, because I think that those numbers could have been masking something. So how do you personally feel? Do you think that women in the armed forces are as safe as they would be in civilian life? It's a very straightforward question.
I don't. Okay, sorry, go.
We have more levers at our disposal. I'm not confident that we've done enough, but am I confident that we are trying to do everything we can, and am I confident that where somebody raises a complaint, it will be investigated and they will have access to justice in an independent sense? Yes, absolutely.
I'm hearing no.
That's okay. Fine. That's not what we're saying. You continue to ask us whether we are confident to make a statement about a world outside of the armed forces that we have no control over. 798,000 women were subject to sexual offences. I don't know how many more went unreported. We can't judge that. What we can tell you is about what we care about, which is making women feel safe in the work environment and doing everything we can to do that, to make sure that the armed services are as operationally effective as they can be, because that's what the country expects of us.
Can I ask General Roly, you mentioned earlier that the 4% in the service that are responsible for
all of the collective offences. Yeah.
How can you be confident in those numbers when there's clearly an awful lot of people that aren't reporting or that are being shut down when they do report? So that doesn't actually get any further.
So I recognise where you're going in terms of if people don't have confidence in the complaint system, or they're not going to come forward, in which case we're not going to know about it. So I think that's really where you're getting at. How confident I am that we are getting at those. My engagement with the Army Service Women's Network and the personal experiences tell me that we should have low confidence that we are creating the environment where service women can come to work and feel valued for what they do in a way that is treated equitably with their male counterparts, and that they feel safe, because self-evidently through the complaints they don't. So I would say mid to low confidence that we know the whole story. High confidence that I've got a chain of command that is committed to getting under the skin of this as best as possible. Where interesting, there was a survey. It's not, I think, of all women. I mean, I think it went to all service women, but not all responded. But what I think is the key themes is unwanted sexual behaviour and unacceptable behaviour was on the list, but it wasn't number one. There were other things that mattered more. One was just fairness in the workplace mattered. Managing being a mother and being a soldier, and some of the physical standards. So that's not in any way to say it's not important. It's just that there are lots of other things that we are trying to address to improve the experience that women have in service. So, I mean, self-evidently, a lot more to do, and let's do it with the networks.
Right. Thank you. Derek Twigg, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just ask each chief, just for the record, how many victims of sexual harassment and abuse have you met in the last 12 months? Start with the Navy.
Well, directly, I spent a very uncomfortable 90 minutes with Miss Sophie Brooke, at which she talked very candidly about her experiences.
So that's one, yeah.
I've informally met a couple of others who have talked to me about their experiences, but not as a result of a direct investigation, because that would, if there was an investigation ongoing, that would have been inappropriate. Yeah. And then every time I go and visit a unit, I will go and find some of the women on board and ask them how they feel, how do they experience service life. Yeah. And they tend not to, at that moment, turn around to a service chief 4-star and say, I've been the direct attack.
Okay. Because of time. Chief? 4.
I'd say 15 to 20.
Okay. Can we move on to the probably the most vulnerable group of people, which is the under-18s? And can we look at the Army Foundation College? Can you tell me how many complaints have been made about bullying or sexual harassment or assault in the last 2 years?
Not immediately to hand, but I can get back to you with the statistics.
I think you should know that, given it's important. Given when you come in here today, you don't know that.
So, apologies. I mean, I don't want to give you misleading data.
And what about the Navy in terms of young people who new recruits, and in terms of training and abuse and harassment complaints being made?
I do not know the answer to that. I'll have to get back to you.
Could you just spell out the question, please, Mr.
Well, the question is, in terms of new recruits, young people, I'm particularly...
How many new recruits
how
who
many,
are under 18, or how many new recruits?
How many complaints have been made by under 18s about abuse, sexual harassment or abuse? Or
not aware of any complaints made by under 18s. There are about 140 under 18s in our system in the Royal Air Force. I'm not aware of any.
AFC Harrogate, we have in 2023, so from 2019 to 2024, there's been one conviction.
It's complaints, not convictions.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah.
Well, then I'll stop there.
Okay. Can I just turn as well to the issue about training? Again, come back to you, General Walker. We had a debate on this committee in 2023 with Minister Murson about the threshold, and we go back to the Foundation College, for basically removing people who are involved, the trainers, from their job. And there was an issue about the threshold what that would be. I mean, clearly, where someone is convicted, that would be very clear. But for instance, sexual banter, would that be a reason to remove someone who's in a training position for a young person? So I'm really trying to, because what Minister Mures couldn't say is exactly what the threshold was. He said it was still debatable. So I just wonder what the current position is. If someone who's got that very important role of training a young person, and a very vulnerable person at that age, would sexual banter mean they will be removed from that position?
It would qualify by a definition as unacceptable sexual behaviour. Yeah. So the presumption of a complaint, if proved, the presumption is discharge. That is the zero tolerance policy. And where that has been applied, it has resulted in where trainers have been involved in USB, they have been discharged to the number of 4. Yeah.
How many have been discharged?
4.
4 in the last...
I'd need to get back to you whether it's in the last 12 months or 18 months. I'll get you all the statistics that we have on this.
Can you tell me what they were discharged for?
I will not be drawn because of the risk of identification of the people involved in the low numbers, that it might begin to give opportunity for identification. So I think we need to be careful about how we go in the session, but certainly we can follow it up. To the point about would banter, I think this would be down to the specific case. The presumption is discharge. It will be down to the deciding body, which, as we've heard, is done independently, not by the chain of command. So if this were to happen in a training establishment like Harrogate and a complaint were made, it would be dealt with outside of that chain of command. There would be a range of mitigating factors and aggravating factors. But the mitigating factors would need to be very strong indeed.
So it's not automatic then if a trainer engaged in sexual banter with a trainee?
I think that would have to come down to the specifics of the case and what would judge as the mitigating or the aggravating features. A mitigating feature, if I can just elaborate, because I think, just want to make this point, may well be the view of the trainee. It may well be the degree of remorse shown by the instructor. It may be the degree to which this was not intentional to offend. It might have been
so some of the other changes that the Army have put in the last couple of years is a comprehensive change in terms of how they select and train their...
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but we are limited for time, but I think we've got it clear that it's still not a very clear guide, that it's not automatic. Admiral, what about the Navy?
We operate to exactly the same, which is unwanted, unwelcome sexual behaviours exhibited by any instructor towards a trainee, regardless of age, in training. There is a presumption of discharge.
Exactly the same.
Yeah. And that is a zero tolerance policy.
Sorry, how many in the Navy have been discharged in the last...
I do not know the breakdown. I can get back to you with the breakdown from training. As if by magic.
So from an Air Force perspective, Mr Twigwell, the First Sea Lord, just looks at the data. I know that in the training machine, we have not had any complaints and discharges for people in the training machine. Right. We take a great deal of care in our selection and training and development.
It's working perfectly then in the RF.
What I just described to you is the facts of the case.
3 cases, 3 discharged.
3 cases, 2 discharged. When was that, sorry?
That is
the zero tolerance came in.
It's November 22. Since the zero tolerance policy came in.
So zero tolerance sexual offences, zero tolerance unacceptable behaviour, 57 offenders, of which 49 have been discharged or dismissed. Okay. 2 cannot be administrative discharge due to being awarded a punishment at court martial, which is immediately rehabilitation. Okay. Right. So 57 and 49 have been removed.
Okay, thank you. Well, Minister, it's coming, and maybe the Chief as well, but Minister, so coming back to your announcement today about the Central Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force, which is to drive cultural improvements. You're going to lead that. Who's leading at what rank each of the services?
Correct. So from our perspective, we're going to build a task force that will sit with us.
So what rank will lead for each service?
So at my level, we will run the violence and...
I get your level, I'm talking about the services.
Well, then you can allow me to explain the whole structure. It may be taken out of context and therefore not really understood by everybody else that's listening. So the Violence and Women and Girls Task Force will be held at my level, and then down into the single services, we will have individual strands of people who can be approached or... open to any discussion on violence against women and girls, sexual harassment, that will be outside of the chain of command. They will be independent to the chain of command, so they won't be a rank, they won't be in the system.
And so the Defence Serious Crime Unit and the Victim and Witness Care Unit are going to be closely aligned to this. One of the real advantages of the Victim and Witness Care Unit that we have feedback from folk is that they're civilian, because that again gives them that further independence.
I may be confused, and I personally it's my sort of
Let
shortcoming on my part. But
Could I perhaps explain it then?
yeah, but
Let's start at the top. So at my level, there's a Violence and Women Girls Task Force.
Sorry, I want to be specific. Who, there's got to be it must be somebody that you want to drive this for each single service to work together as part of your task force. So I'm asking what level.
What I'd like to say is the Violence and Women and Girls Task Force that we're creating will set the strategy and culture. That will drive it down through the people departments that sit within the Army and the Navy and Air Force, which is usually, correct me if I'm wrong, a 2-star.
Yeah.
But independent to that, what we can't have is individuals in the Violence and Women and Girls Task Force that are in the rank structure.
Right.
And so what we've been really clear about is we want individuals that are outside of the single service, the Army, the Navy and Air Force, but are attached to it, outside of the command system, of where if I'm a young lady corporal coming through the system, I've got a complaint and I don't want to go to my corporal, my sergeant, my troop commander, or even the welfare officer, I can go to the Violence and Women and Girls Task Force office that sits on camp, speak to the individual, and that complaint will be raised rapidly up the side of the system without going through the chain of command.
Yeah, thank you. General, I'm absolutely flabbergasted that you've not got the stats on Harrogate, because as far as I can see, we've got a problem at Harrogate in terms of, as Derek Twigg mentioned, that we're dealing with the most vulnerable, that young girls under the age of 18. Right, let me go through, obviously I read through a whole load of stats before today's session, and it became apparent to me in 2021, so these are not just current stats, 2021, 37 girls were victims in sexual offence cases opened by the service police. And there were 9 reports of rape, and not to mention 2 complaints of sexual assault, another 2 of voyeurism. So, if we just put that into context, into the stats, that is 12.8%. So 37 girls out of 290. Now that compares with 1.2% in terms of women across the adult female personnel. So what's being done to get to grips with the situation? Because failures in the system have literally led women and young girls to attempt suicide. So, do you acknowledge that there is a problem at Harrogate?
I think the official line is usually the low numbers of instances, which I'll get back to you with the specifics. There is a case of risk of identification of victims, and we've already named the place which narrows it. So I don't want to sort of dwell on that any further. The general point, Chair, I think with regards to the AFC Harrogate, is the start date of the junior soldiers, as in terms of the prevalence of exposure to sexual material, sexualised behaviours, abuse, domestic abuse and violence prior to arriving. So what we have recognised is there is a significant transition for junior soldiers arriving at Harrogate, where not only do they need to onboard the much higher standards of values and standards that we have for our armed forces personnel, but there's also a recognition of their experiences that have got them to that stage before. So we have a much more front-loaded programme of preparation. So prior to arriving at the Armed Forces College, the Army Foundation College at Harrogate, all entrants will go through a programme of understanding the Army's values and standards. We have seen a 500...
When did you initiate that change, sorry?
That was in 2022. We have seen a 500% increase in the time allocated in the first 5 to 6 weeks of their time at Harrogate, where they go through specific training and education focused on consent training, values and standards, and acceptable behaviours. You have a much higher rate of safeguarding at Harrogate than you do in any other military establishment, and it has been praised, as I'm sure in the written response, the college has been recognised by Ofsted, as well as the local education authority, for the high standards of safeguarding.
I mean,
none of that is to in any way dismiss.
But ultimately, I think people are being let down, those young girls, because those safeguarding measures are not in place. And, I'm not some sort of professional politician or professional statistician, but the stats just don't bear recognition with, I think, what's
May I interject
being,
just ever so slightly on the statistics? In Harrogate, we employ the zero tolerance policy, which means all allegations of inappropriate behaviour are automatically referred to the police. All allegations. Now, that could be a comment in the dinner queue. It could be an inappropriate touching that in other cases, other colleges around the country would not be referred to the police. And I go back to the AIM principles: inappropriate, problematic, abusive and violent. Every single case, every incident in Harrogate, we push to the police. And so the statistics in some cases haven't been broken down into those three categories. Now, we could adopt that, but what we are really clear on, as we take a large proportion, 12% of the junior soldiers come from the most deprived social and economic backgrounds, 80% come from lower to middle social economic backgrounds. We've got hard yards to take those individuals in and inculcate the culture of zero tolerance on that group. I think there's more work for us to do. I went to Harrogate 2 months ago to actually look at the command chain, to really give myself a feel of whether I thought that individuals between 16, 18 and 19 were being looked after and had the right network around them. And I was really impressed. And I would love HCDC as a whole to please come and visit Harrogate, because I think until you see it, it's difficult to understand.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I could delve into this a lot deeper, given the information that I've got in front of me, including, by the way, it's interesting, Minister, that you should mention the dinner queues and so on. Is that racist abuse also against black staff? And some of my discussions with the Centre for Military Justice, I know we're not delving into racism in this particular session, but some of the women who have gone through horrendous experiences, and they have a problem in terms of intersectionality, they're getting a double whammy. Not only are they being discriminated against because they're a woman, but also because they are an ethnic minority on top of that. But I mean, because of the lack of time, I won't be able to delve further into that, but I do hope that is being seriously looked at, because no doubt we 100%. Will be coming back to this. I want to bring in Fred Thomas there as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much to all of you for laying out in some detail and on the record the action you're taking within your relative services or within the department to try and get a grip of what we can all acknowledge is a serious problem. You've put that on the record now, so we've heard those things. I'm grateful for them. I'm going to ask a question about barriers now, and I'm going to come to you, Admiral, to ask about the Navy. And I would very much encourage you to bear in mind we've heard all the positive steps you're taking. The question I have is, what is your understanding of what the barriers are that stop women making formal complaints? And why is it that so many women sit on experiences of harassment or sexual misconduct for years and years and years, and maybe they never report it, or maybe it comes out on social media in years to come by, or maybe it's a known fact among the unit, but they never actually report it in any of the formal structures you've mentioned?
Thank you very much for that question, and I can just come back to Mr. Twigg. No complaints have been made by under 18s under the USB regulations that have been registered in the Navy. None. To answer your question, what are the barriers? I think the barriers have been cultural and confidence, some of which have been well rehearsed by Marriott Hughes. So the confidence ones were that they would not be listened to, they would not be taken seriously, because very often the complaints were going to be overseen by someone who was in their immediate chain of command. That we have removed. Any complaint now is triaged, separate, independent of the chain of command. On occasions that was because the chain of command was felt to be implicated. On other occasions it was just the lack of confidence that the system would even be listened to. But we have taken all of that out now so that the chain of command does not have a role. Secondly, there was a feeling that the raising a complaint would in some way become career injurious to that individual. By taking that and making it independent, and the determination independent, and then being really clear on the actions that we have taken and the manner in which we have upheld our policies, which have also changed in recent years, that has started to instill a greater confidence that raising a concern it will be investigated, and where action is, an appropriate action will be taken. That confidence is beginning to instill. The next thing we've come, and this was very much my experience with the Lieutenant Brooke, former Lieutenant Brooke case, and I think it's redolent also, reminiscent of what we experienced with the Fill Your Boots feedback, was that people reported stuff that predated a number of actions that have now been taken. And so when I then, through the climate team that we've set up, the culture team that we've set up, the leadership activity that we're doing, whenever I'm on board a ship, one of the things I ask of groups of women is, do you feel confident that if you had a problem, you know the route to having it raised, and that you will be listened to fairly and effectively because of that independence? Now, clearly, I recognise I'm a number of ranks up, and I may get back feedback that they think I want to hear, which is why we double-check this with the climate surveys and all the rest of it. But in the main, we are getting a stronger voice being played back to us. It's not universal, it's not unanimous, and it's not volume 10. We've got distance to go. But we're getting a stronger voice. And if I could just give an example, I think, of where we're changing. On board a submarine, when the External Challenge Panel, the MOD External Challenge Panel, visited one of our submarines recently, they went down into the torpedo shop, and the female pet officer engineer with her team was explaining what goes on down and how we move torpedoes around and load the tubes and all the rest of it. And then the challenge panel deliberately said, how do you feel as a woman? And she said, I'm a team. They've got my back. I've got my back. The only thing that matters is I wear dolphins. Now, we are getting a different sort of language being played back to us. I don't for 1 minute want to sound complacent. But what we learn, we've still got a lot to do. Every week a new group of people join the Royal Navy who are coming from a background where we've got to say, whatever you used to do, these are our values and standards now. This is the way we behave. And if you fall short of that, we will take action.
Brilliant. That's certainly a positive outlook. You mentioned the submarine service there. In your command, very different structures. The Royal Marines, on one hand, very heavily male-dominated infantry soldiers. Then the submarine service, which you alluded to there. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges of discouraging sexual misconduct and bullying, particularly in submarines, and what's distinctive about that? Because so many people listening to this hearing won't have been in a submarine. What are the particular challenges that you face there?
Well, you know from your own service, every part of the armed forces, what's required of that unit, depending upon what we're asking them to do, how we're asking them to live, the sort of environment that they're going to operate in, requires subtly different means in order to come together and to be the most effective fighting unit that they can be. Because after all, that's on submarines. But on board a submarine, we've made a number of changes now to make sure that women, the mess deck provision is
respectfully, don't mean to interrupt too much, but just for time, not the changes you've made. What are the challenges of that unique environment? Why is it that there's a public perception that submarines breed? That's not my perception, but you understand this is out there. Breed a kind of very distinct type of bullying and negative culture. Could you speak to the challenges for a second? Just to acknowledge
the challenges are living in a very enclosed space, dive for extremely long periods of time when you don't have any contact with the outside world. You know, these people are isolated from their loved ones, more so than even the people on the International Space Station, because at least people in the ISS can Skype home. And so you've put a really enclosed community together, living in very confined conditions, and that requires remarkable leadership in order to create that right climate. But if you invest in the leadership teams, you make sure that they're appropriately balanced. We use a huge amount of mentoring and assessment to make sure they're prepared for whatever we're asking them to do, and then we do checkbacks during the training programs and all the rest of it. You can create, and you also make sure that there are sufficient role models, female role models, and routes through where younger sailors can raise their concerns. Then we are slowly but surely demonstrating what is expected, and we're also dealing with those who fall short. It is true to say that with women having gone to sea in submarines many years after we took women to sea in surface ships, that we probably were slightly caught out, we were caught off guard by thinking, well, they go to sea in surface ships, therefore it'll be easy to take them to sea in submarines. We didn't make enough of that early investment to really set the conditions for success. I pay huge tribute to the leadership of the submarine service and the courageous things that they have done to root out poor leadership with a number of discharges from the service, and at the same time to invest in creating the right climate and ensuring that the command teams feel supported in putting that right climate in place.
Thank you.
Fred, I think lack of a safe space is one of the biggest barriers.
Good. Thank you. Ian Room, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to talk about recruitment and retention now in the armed forces, which I think is a particular challenge when it comes to females. For example, in 2020, the service has set themselves a target of 15% to recruit, which have now been quietly dropped in those targets. And I think it was only met, actually, by the RAF. Up until 30th of September 2024, the recruitment of female personnel was 12.2% in the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, 9.4% in the Army, and 15.8% in the RAF. So how focused are you in recruiting female applicants to the armed forces?
I think it's absolutely critical we get as many females as we can into the military. Diversity, firm believer, is a strength, not a weakness. It's essential in planning. It's essential in every aspect of the military as we move forward. What I would say, it's actually quite difficult. There's a whole set of cultural barriers, and I mean from societal perspective. But we are making headroads into that. We've seen an increase. It's a small increase, but we've seen an increase of 0.2% in women coming into the military, and some really positive statistics around women staying longer in the military now. We've seen OF5, so the colonel level, we've seen that double, and at the 1-star level, we've seen it triple. And of course, we've got the Vice Chief of Defence Staff as well, right at the top shop, which is one thing when speaking to the women networks in defence, is the availability of role models for those coming up and through the system. The one thing they've asked for is an effective system for role models that they can see and help them come up and through. And so we've got a lot of different programs running. The RAF, the Navy and the Army are working at it to do it. I do believe that whilst we've said that 30% by 2030 is a target, I actually think it's an ambition, and I think it'll be very difficult to hit that ambition. I think we need to be realistic.
What do you see as some of the barriers to recruitment at the moment?
So, I mean, we've seen a 3%, over the last 4 years, we've seen a 3% increase in the number of women. So, and that's a kind of by an additional 3%, not 3% on a small number. But, and we've seen an 8% increase in the number of expressions of interest from women, which says to us that the stories we're trying to tell, the opportunities we're trying to portray are landing, but we've got a lot to do. One of the big challenges for us is that we recruit over half of our people into technical careers, and STEM, young girls in STEM, is still hugely challenged for the country as a whole. Now, we, for a couple of years, had a female officer actually placed on secondment into the Department of Education to help us understand how we could bridge that gap, how we could work more closely with schools, how we could open up, how we could create a narrative that opened up that opportunity to say, actually, careers in STEM, technical branches are available in the armed forces, and all of this works to your benefit. So we are trying to, and I don't make any excuses, we're trying to buck a national trend in order to bring in the amount of talent. And it's exactly as the Minister has said, our best chance of achieving that is increasing the number of role models who are telling great stories about their experiences and allowing that to cascade, both in senior positions, and as I said, well, two of the three engineer officers on board HMS Prince of Wales at the moment are women, at the rank of commander, so they're telling out their great stories, and both of them are able to do that having had families, or having families. They haven't, sort of with children and with a dual spousal career. All of that would say to me that we're slowly but surely knocking down the barriers that have tended to make it difficult for women to be successful. But those role models, plus the younger ones, that increase in numbers and getting those stories out is the sort of thing we just need to keep doing time and time and time again, so that young girls in the school system can look at it and go, I can see myself as that individual having that sort of life, doing that sort of meaningful work, and to other members, and I feel completely safe and confident that I'll be able to go to work in that environment. If we get that right, then we will find our natural numbers.
May I just come in there? So retention and recruitment, both of which lead to an increase in the size of the Air Force and the other armed services are one of the very top priorities, because we don't have the number of people we need right across the services. What I want is to recruit the very best people into the armed services, and it seems to me entirely ludicrous to imagine that women should not be included in that cohort of the very best people. But just to give you some kind of confidence around this, I mean, in 24-25, the numbers are looking at about 16.5%, is the most recent stats I got in terms of women joining. But in 2022, we had just over 4,000 applications from women. In 2023, we had 5,700 applications. And in 2024, we had over 7,000 applications from women. So we are definitely doing something right. But 70% of our professions in the Air Force are STEM-related. And when fewer than 1 in 5 women and girls study STEM-related subjects at A-level and university, that is a real challenge. We have to outperform the rest of society if we're going to do that. Part of the way we do that is demonstrating what a great career it is and giving people those role models and the phenomenal training that we provide and the responsibility that we get. But the hard data says that we are definitely making progress.
The statistics are really sort of pretty even, really. I think we got 11% intake and about 9% outflow. So we're doing something right there. And you know, that's consistent with international recruitment as well compared to other forces. However, what specific plans, maybe, Minister, have we got for, say, the 10-year time period? You know, what sort of targets? I know you alluded to 30-40%, but what specific plans are you going to put in place rather than just pick a number out of the air?
Well, Open the Armed Forces Recruitment Programme 2027 is going to look at how we do recruitment as a whole and increase the ability and reduce the time of flight from when an individual puts an application in to the point of where they join. That's the biggest reason, whether it's male or female, while people drop away. So we've got to reduce that time of flight to get in. That's not female specific, that's recruitment as a whole. Sometimes it's taking over 250 days from an individual applying to then signing up and turning up at the front gate. That's just too long. So we've got to reduce that down. In the Armed Forces Bill, we're looking at putting the spectrum service, so it's easier to move between commitment types. So in particular, service categories, which will give people a better balance between family life and work and provide more variable working hours. We've got wraparound childcare that's in place. And each single service has their own programme to increase recruitment of females across all of the services. It's worth noting, though, women are really well represented in logistics, personnel, medical and intelligence. They're less well represented in the technical trades. That was mentioned by the lack of STEM qualifications in sort of women in broader society, and in particular in ground close combat roles, which talks to earlier that tipping balance where you have a certain amount of people within a regiment or a unit that provides that sort of safe space and commonality with their fellow soldiers, sailors or airmen. I don't know if there's any specifics you want to cover, Sam.
So I think the specific is experimenting at Sandhurst based on best advice possible. They're trying to, what is the optimum critical mass you need in any given unit of action that results in the breakdown of prejudice and misogynist behaviours and that everyone's valued, and it's around 30%. So the loading at Sandhurst and they're doing the trials on this to validate the data, is making sure you've got a sort of 30% male to female in selected platoons or companies, and then seeing the impact over time in terms of performance, wastage and training, as well as longer term career. So there's a longitudinal side to this which we need to sort of see playing through in terms of return of service. To my colleagues' various points, so we have seen about a 6.2% increase in the expressions of interest from female citizens to join the army. I think we are at a 20-80 split for soldiers, regular and reserve. I think I'm correct in saying as officers, expression of interest is nearer 75-25, which is positive. The conversion into what we call trade trained, i.e. they are they're in a career as opposed to training, is less, and we've clearly got a lag in the overall numbers that are around, as you say, 10.5% of the regular force. 15% of the reserve force is female. So
can I just come in on that, General? What do you think, or to your knowledge, what's your leadership teams telling you why people are not carrying on from the application to conversion to actually being in the job. What are some of the reasons why females are not carrying on with the application? Is it the length of time?
I think that's generic to a lot of young people who are trying to join. And sometimes the time away from home is a challenge. Maybe there are family issues, which means that they leave. That's a high number of why junior soldiers leave. Some conclude that it's just not the career for them, that they're either not good at it or they didn't want to try it. And so you see a sort of conversion rate and a level of wastage. It's gone from around a third wasted in training once they started a training depot, and we're getting that closer to a quarter. In some trade groups, as the Minister said, it's much higher success rate. So in most of the logistical and medical units, it's much higher. I think I'm correct in saying in some of our medical units we have nearly a 50-50 split male-female. But I think what that betrays is in some of our ground combat unit is much lower, and we're not nearly near a critical mass that begins to make cultural change in the way they conceive of fighting power. So I think there is a much more systemic and strategic agenda that I am keen to explore, which is around how we frame basic training. So, for example, if you frame basic training and the basic military syllabus around infantry soldiering, then don't be surprised that for a lot of people, that's not what they wanted to do in the army. So really the basics we need to do in recruit training is you need to be able to shoot, because you've got to be able to fight. You've got to be able to move physically on your feet as well as in a vehicle. You've got to be able to communicate. You've got to be able to medicate. So in a sense, our common military syllabus needs to focus on the basics to be a soldier, to survive on a battlefield and fight for your life if you have to.
Okay.
We therefore look at is how do we reframe our training around that rather than an overemphasis on the infantry being the entry standard because of the barriers that particular trade group brings to not just women in the army but also men as well.
I was just going to say, when I joined the Air Force, from me going into the recruitment office, I was in within 6 weeks, because we had our own medical trained personnel, doctors, who would sign and take the risks, whereas recruitment agencies that we're using, without mentioning any names, are most probably just following policy. And I know that we've had incidents reported to us as a committee where somebody's waited 3 years to be admitted to the forces. Since I've been on this committee, I thought it might have been just over a year. But only last week we were told somebody who was just starting in the forces now applied 3 years ago. And I'm just thinking, what can we do to speed this up? Because I know that's a desire from this government that they announced to the House a few months ago.
I don't want to drift off now. I know Sam wants to come in and say something.
So just if you're talking about specific female barriers, I think there are a number, and some of them are reflected in wider society. And there's oft quoted sort of research about if there's a job spec with 10 items, if a man can do 3 of them, they'll go for it. A woman wants to be confident that they can do almost all of them. So I think there is something, and actually if you look at about page 63, 64 of the evidence provided, the Army in particular have some really good examples of work that they are doing to build that relationship and build that confidence. I think also when we're looking at physical fitness, again, in the society that we are in, that is something that, and these are slight generalisations, but women are slightly more, less confident in sort of being able to meet certain physical expectations. So there's some really great work that has been going on to look at those areas where perhaps confidence is slightly lower and help build that confidence through coaching, through early interventions, through visibility of role models. Some terrific work done on the Service Women's Handbook that you would have seen, the perinatal handbook that's now come out. We're hoping to launch fairly soon some great work by colleagues in the Army about women in arduous training as well. So all of those are actually really important pieces to help just boost that little bit of confidence so that folk are less likely to withdraw. So I think those are the sorts of things that all the services are doing that are really helping in terms of you've got what they've seen is a real increase in expressions of interest, converting that through the system, recognising some of those nuances that some of our women might have. I think that's going to be a key thing that we'll start to see land in the not too distant future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jesse Norman, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Just on that last question, Minister, can you just tell me, or tell the committee, what your number of days, your target number of days is for reducing the recruitment time over time, so that people can know they're going to get into the service or not quickly?
Yeah, I mean, we need to reduce it a minimum of threefold. At the moment, you're in excess of 200 days. We've already
that would be down to 70 days, if you like.
We've already put down a provisional offer at 10 days and 30 days. That was announced by the Defence Secretary. We've seen we've run that through in several cases. We need to expand that much broader. The issue is about getting hold of medical records, which I'm sure you're aware of. We've got to write a letter to get a medical record back. We've got to check it, and that process adds in 30 to 50 days into it. And you add in all the administration, it expands. So we need to reduce that. And once we've got someone who's interested, we need to give them a provisional offer and get them into the gate within 30 to 70 or so days.
That's great, thanks. Sam, can I ask, obviously one of the things that armed forces do is to provide incredible amounts of structure and opportunity to young people who might come from very difficult backgrounds, something we often forget. Do you benchmark the experience of young people as they come into the armed forces in order to assess whether or not you're able to have a positive effect on male behaviour towards women, females, etc., etc.?
So I would say single service colleagues, particularly in some of our phase 1 training establishments, are doing a lot of that. I think we've certainly got an ambition to do a lot more, and we were just talking about our conversations with Jess Phillips as Minister of Safeguarding and Violence Against Women. Defence is really keen to lean into some of these opportunities. Actually, how can we learn about some of the things that across government we might be wanting to experiment with in the school system? Actually, can we experiment with some of those things in some of our phase 1 training areas? But equally, actually, I know some of the statistics and cases you've been quoting are sort of 2021, 2022. Some of the changes we've been delivering in the last couple of years in particular are things that actually colleagues across government and internationally are learning from us. So I think that richness of sharing, and we're going to run an event with international colleagues and hopefully with cross-government colleagues later in September or October. There's a real opportunity here. I think the service environment is unique, service justice is unique, but they're both small, flexible and agile where we can try some of those things out. So I would say there is some really great work going on, but we are ambitious to expand that, recognising how can we influence men and young boys as well as supporting women.
Right, but sorry, there's an awful lot of words there. I hope what you're saying is we take the question of benchmarking young people when they come in, both male and female, very seriously. We can track whether they're coming in with better or less good forms of behaviour, and what the, as it were, necessary steps we need to take to integrate them into the service might be.
So
that's a yes.
So absolutely, and 500% increase in Harrogate in terms of focus on those sort of areas, looking at those attitudes surveys.
We're terribly short of time, so sorry. Minister, we've heard some very interesting feedback, and it's a very mixed picture, but obviously service chiefs are, I think, cautiously positive about decisions and steps that they're taking. What measures do you take and will you take to hold them to account to make sure that these agendas are being really driven through the services?
Yeah, so we hold a meeting with Sam and a selective group of women across Defence once every month. That's really my feedback of how the single service is doing, but also how the grassroots feel is outside of the single service, and that includes the civil service within the Ministry of Defence as well. So that's a really good, from my perspective, to get the understanding. And then we've got the statistics that come through on almost a monthly basis, which will allow me to combine the facts and the understanding together to be able to hold people to account. I will go back to it. I do think we're on a positive trajectory. It is a bit like an oil tank. It takes time to change. We're pushing as hard, as fast as we can. And I do think some of the measures that we put in place just the last couple of weeks, from the Tri-Service Complaints Unit all the way through to the Violence and Women's Girl Task Force designed sort of with Jess Phillips and co, will just provide a safe space for women who I go back to when I was a young recruit. I know you're short on time, but when you're looking up, it's very difficult to find somewhere to complain if you have an issue. I can imagine if you've got 3 men here telling you how women feel, pretty ironic. But the reality is, if I was a woman in that space, who do I speak to? There's no one. And so by creating this Violence and Women and Girl Task Force that sits there, it will give you a safe space to go to raise an issue.
Yeah. And where the culture of an armed force is about martial valour, success in combat, we're in a pre-war situation, how you give the prestige and the support to female role models in that context becomes, I would think, additionally
100%. And Ukraine, much of our European partners, Israel, for example, show just how valuable women are in defence, as do the UK. We've got some fantastic women sat behind me who are net contributors to defence and absolutely top of their game, and the best in the world.
Okay, that's great. There's a rather unfortunate kind of iteration where particular subcultures are discovered often through the media. Could be Harrogate, could be subs, could be Red Arrows. It feels like a surprise to the service in question. They're suddenly backpedaling, change occurs. How do you get ahead of that? Are there particular areas, I'm not expecting you to name subcultures within the armed forces now, but if you were able to write to us to give us a sense of comfort that you were aware that there were potentially emerging problems in areas so that we didn't feel this was continuously a matter of catch-up. It's not an easy question, but I'd be terribly grateful if you
So
consider
we will write back. I'll just cover off. I think the First Sea Lord highlighted, getting ahead of that case. It's actually when you pick up on a culture that you think is going wrong, it's usually through a command and leadership channel. You identify it and then you remove that individual before the incident or the culture is set place. It is absolutely about command and leadership. But to remove that individual completely out of the military before anything has happened usually means realigning him to a role where he maybe has less responsibility, she has less responsibility over an organisation. So I would love to write to you in due course.
Can I just pile in on that, which is, so absolutely the number is cautious optimism that we're heading in the right direction. But I thought there was a very, very interesting piece in the Sunday papers by Matthew Syed on misogyny as a feature of society. It's getting harder. Likewise, I think a few weeks ago by Melanie Phillips saying exactly the same thing. So in a sense, where we're heading is this gets harder because of some of these baked-in behaviours that we are increasingly seeing as prevalent in society. So I think there is absolutely a desire, to your point, and with the Minister, is to recognise where the continuities are in the trends, but to try and find a way to get ahead of that. And I do think there is a degree, certainly as far as the Army is concerned, and I touched on it, in the framing of how we do basic training, which I think then makes this even harder to challenge, because you're making it what Mike Wixon report to in his report as hypermasculinity. We've got to recode how we view professional armed services in the 21st century. And there is nothing that I've seen about combat that means one gender is better than another. So we need to get over that and reframe and recode how we start and frame this to the society, because we need the best citizens in this country to join our armed forces so we can play our full and active role in our responsibilities as one of NATO's leading powers. So to me, that is it.
And final question, what are the general, well, we're going to start with you, but it'd be good to go all 3 chiefs. What are the specific obstacles that stop women progressing into your roles, for example?
There's nothing to stop them coming to my role. In fact, Sharon is now a 4-star general on the and the number 2 in defence. So, and she moved from being the deputy chief of the general staff to now being the vice chief. And you saw her last year when she was here as she was the deputy chief of general staff. So I think there aren't any obstacles. There is no obstacle. I think there is a reality of a career progression and an advancement through the career we have to recognise is a different experience. And again, a lot of the statistics show, and the analysis shows that for service women, it can be a harder path. It can be a harder path in terms of the balancing of what they're trying to do with lives, particularly around responsibilities as mothers and the dual-serving nature of couples. So there are some practical areas where the data is telling us that we're making this harder for female soldiers and officers to
You're trying to lean in on those caring responsibilities.
They are. It's this is a collective effort by us. These officers and soldiers, they're not just in the army, and I said they are the army. So we are doing this to ourselves. And I think the confidence I have is that this is not a top-down directed only activity. This is a groundswell of almost not in our name do we behave like this. And we have collectively got to come together as a group and sort this out ourselves, because no one else is going to do it. And the nation expects us.
Thank you, Evan.
There is no part of the Royal Navy that a woman cannot join now. And there is no
obstacles to getting to your job.
And there is no policy reason why a woman cannot serve in my position.
What about non-policy reasons, Admiral? What about other obstacles that might prevent a woman from taking your role over time?
So I think we face exactly the same challenges as Roly, as the Army, and probably in the Air Force, which is creating a completely equitable, fair means by which, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, the career opportunities to advance up through are the same, and you can also enjoy those other factors of life outside of wearing a uniform that I have been able to do. I have been able to get married. I have children. My wife and I have made choices between us, but if we were the other way around, sometime in the past, that would have been a much, much harder thing to deliver. And particularly when you've then got dual service couples. And so that work still has some distance to go, and before we can say with complete confidence that it matters not who you are, or whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're serving in a single or a dual, all of those will be managed and taken into account as you go through, because we have to deal with the one physiological difference is that only women can have babies. And we just have to build that into our system and accept it. I sadly am part of an era where I grew up. I know that some of my female colleagues in younger era were having comments written in their annual appraisals which pointed out that they were women. And I look back on that with shame now. At the time it sort of seemed what you did, but there is no way. There were really talented women of my generation who could not go any further or any faster because of those constraints. Slowly but surely, wherever we bump into them, we are knocking them down. There is no policy reason. We're now into making sure that actually the system recognises that and adapts accordingly. Because we need, as all of my colleagues have said, we want the very best of the talent available in the country in order to defend the nation.
Thank you, Edgy.
As Ben said, there are no policy constraints, but as you rightly point out, there are kind of cultural, behavioural aspects that can make things harder. When you speak to senior women, they will tell you they think it's harder for them. Yeah. They have to be better and they have to work harder
than the equivalent men.
For
the same position.
Yeah. Now, what we know in the Air Force, historically, the Chief of the Air Staff has always been a pilot, and actually our representation of women in aircrew is low, below 10% in terms of number. So immediately the pool is somewhat smaller. I am certain that in the future we will see a woman in my role as Chief of the Air Staff. And when we look at the data around promotions and command appointments, which have always been routes to more senior positions, and thanks to changes made by my predecessor, more command appointments are opened up to non-pilots, non-aircrew. And we've seen so now 29% of my group captain command appointments are filled by women. 2 years ago, that was down at about 17%. Warrant officers in 2010, 2.9% of warrant officers were women. Now it's 15%. So we are starting to see that shift. But we have to do everything we can to make that as frictionless as possible, so that women and men are judged exactly the same way through our system, and we need to make sure that that's how it feels to women as well, and do all that we can to make that happen. And we are definitely making some progress in that just by looking at those numbers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Scroggle, please.
Thank you, Chair. In evidence that you've given to us, there's been a whole host of initiatives around women's health, menstruation, uniform and equipment. But what hasn't been in there are the numbers accessing it. So are women using those services, or are there still barriers to them actually accessing it? So can you give us some detail?
I don't think I have the stats. Sam, do you have any?
Shall I talk to that one? It's something that we talk a lot to our service women's networks about, for example, and just trying to get that understanding. I think we have had a few occasions where perhaps the messages haven't got through to all the relevant folk in terms of knowing that this is important. I think what we are finding is we've created the options, we've created those items, we are now seeing them made available on a far more regular basis, and that when we are going on operations or deployments, it is being embedded in the thinking. So I think we've had a couple of not quite getting it right, but it's moving forward. I think interestingly, one of the things we've reflected, and we've worked really closely, particularly with our Ukrainian colleagues in this space, to learn from their experience as well. And that's got us thinking slightly differently about the provision we have found. So if I can talk quite bluntly in this space, which I think is important, I think what we have been hearing from Ukrainian colleagues who are on the front line, who are operating in a drone warfare world where it is very difficult to get any sort of privacy to look after hygiene and some of those sorts of things. They have really valued the approach that we have taken to those sort of menstrual support boxes, but also they have given us ideas for additional things to add to them, which, because we have not been in that sort of scenario, had not occurred to us. So I think there's a real international kind of two-way learning in terms of how we can make that better. But I think we've certainly had a few occasions where actually those haven't got to the people who have needed them, and that's resulted in particularly the services picking that up and flowing that through the deployment thinking in a far more sort of cohered way. But yeah, I would really pay particular tribute to our Ukrainian women serving, particularly on the front line, because I think what they have experienced and has shown not only the value of that sort of thinking, but also there are things that we just had not thought about, particularly in a world of drone warfare and the urination approaches, menstruation, actually cleanliness and hygiene is something different for women, and that has been really valuable.
And again, with the particular uniforms and equipment, what checks and balances are you putting in place to see how well those initiatives are picked up and used? Do you have a process for measuring that?
So we're just introducing, actually, our Director of Safety has created a new working group, and I'm connecting our service women's networks with her, particularly because we've looked at uniform. We also have to think about PPE as well. So there is a really broad area that we have to think about in this space. I think the services themselves are doing elements of assurance in this. I am really keen to go beyond the sort of the check-ins I have with folk who are actually experiencing using this, to have a assurance is our watchword at this point in the sort of the maturity journey, and that is something that we're really keen to get after. But I think the Director of Safety's work is really going to help on the
Speaking to the Women's Network, there were some issues around availability of maternity uniforms, body armour that was fitted and made for women, rucksacks, backpacks, and all the kit that the male population of defence probably take for granted, to ensure that it's fit and purposeful for women and easily accessible, that they don't have to right away and get a central store to send it forward. And that was absolutely taken on board, so we're looking into that.
Thank you.
Thank you much. There are lots more issues which I know members wanted to discuss, but I fear that the clock has beaten us. But I mean, there are many things that I am still not happy with, in terms of whether I raised the issue earlier about concurrent jurisdiction, how complaints are dealt with. The Independent Defence Authority has also rightly raised concerns about the MOD's increased propensity to use non-statutory inquiries, whereby more and more things are heavily redacted, it takes a long time to report, and it fails to tell victims what has been found and what the consequences have been. And it's basically, in their words, failed to listen to the evidence that women were giving. And also last week we had the former Defence Minister, Johnny Mercer. He himself admitted of a colossal failure whereby he felt that he didn't argue strongly enough to make sure that it was the sexual offences should be dealt with, taken away from the MOD and dealt with by civilian police. Now, Minister, lastly, in opposition, Labour backed the proposal to transfer serious and sexual offences out of military courts. Can you give us an undertaking today whether the MOD, whether the government intends to make that legal change so that women and girls can have that?
I think in 2021 to 2022 we'd absolutely agree, but His Majesty's Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate has already reviewed the service justice system, and providing choice to a victim when they come to the point of where they want the criminal justice system or the service justice system to deal with that case provides the optimal solution for the victim. I don't think it should be on us to tell them which avenue they want to take. So I think choice is the way forward. If you want to take away choice, then we go down one avenue. If you want to deliver choice to them and they can go either way, then those options are available. That is the best solution, speaking to not only the individuals in the service justice system, but the women's networks as well.
I take on board that point, but it is a matter of fact that conviction rate for cases that go to court-martial for rape and sexual assault are far lower than the equivalent figures in the Crown Court.
That is incorrect, and I think we'll provide you the statistics to back that up.
Okay, I'll look forward to receiving that, because that's what our understanding is, including in the evidence that we were provided with by the Centre for Military Justice. Look, lastly, I would like to thank all of your good selves for making the time to come and give evidence at today's hearing. I know that you are all very, very busy individuals. You have an important role to conduct in defence, and at a time when defence is so much into focus. So thank you for your service to our country. As I said at the outset when setting the context, that we are here to ask the difficult questions and we will keep probing on certain matters, but that's our job, that's what we have been elected by Parliament to do. But I do really appreciate the fact that you have made yourself available and you have ensured that we have transparency and accountability, that the very top people who are responsible for the safety and welfare of our brave service women and girls, that you are here to answer our questions. With that, I bring today's hearing on women in the armed forces to a conclusion. Order, order.